I certainly, in the 60s and 70s, didn't admire her particularly for a sense of shared taste in other words. Indeed, the artists whose work she consistently held most dear were artists in whom I personally have very little interest. Samuel Beckett, hands up. Bergman, hands up again. Surely Drodard, small. But anyway, she loved the films of Seidelberg because he was both a Wagnerian and a Brechtian. And I'm afraid to say, really, I'm neither of those important and significant things. I'm touched, however, that right at the end of her life, she noted that poor Seidelberg, because of the terrible transformations of the modes of production and costs of filmmaking in Germany today, as everywhere else, is no longer even able to make films. So her criticism was always connected to some material base of how you make works of art, which I think, again, from the outset, set her out from the other critics. She was a close, lifelong friend of Roland Barthes. Interestingly, whom she knew quite clearly, was far less cosmopolitan than herself. Barthes was, after all, monolingual. He had a bit of Italian, but not much. Almost no English whatsoever. Whereas she was fluent in German, Italian, French, English, probably Hungarian, for all I know. In a way that carved her out from many of the people she most admired in Europe. And I think it's important to remember the cosmopolitan nature of the New York intelligentsia in Europe. It's an old thing one could write a book about, in fact. So often, Americans write books about Paris, but it always seems to me that New York is infinitely more cosmopolitan than Paris or London. But anyway, I'm drifting off here. Nonetheless, she certainly envied, by contrast, the role which he enjoyed in France from the 60s onwards, compared to the relative obscurity of public intellectuals like herself in late 20th century America, even in New York. Her own media celebrity and that of her contemporaries, such as John Updike and James Baldwin, was of a very different, and she felt a much more trivial order. Like her, and I think one of the things that perhaps bound them together, Roland Barthes was always, as you probably know, for those of you who are familiar with his criticism, escaping from prisons that he's set up for himself, always setting up vast, universalizing bodies of theory to explain everything in the universe, and then suddenly realizing it didn't work. Oh my God, what do I do now? And running away and just leaving it to writing something, saying, sorry, that was all bullshit, changed my mind.
Only in French.
Yes, but also I think that's a very good thing to be in that sense. One of the lessons that Susan Sontag taught me, and continues to teach me, is that it's okay to change your mind. Not only is it okay to change your mind, it's not okay, probably, not to change your mind. But again, I'll come back to this point later on. Unlike most American, or for that matter, Anglo-Saxon critics, she automatically read all his later books, including Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes and Fragment and Discours d'Amoureux, as triumphs of modernist fiction, rather than as autobiography, more Proust than confessional Rousseau. Indeed, she shared a distinctly Gallic distaste for the directly biographical in any medium, especially when invoked to explain works of art in any medium. Nonetheless, at the same time, she wasn't entirely uncritical of Barthes, and she had no time whatever, I think, for the whole death of the author hypothesis in his writings or those of Michel Foucault. It's one thing, I think one can see from her writings, she shared with him, to emphasize the importance in our understanding of public meanings, to emphasize the institutional and discursive contextuality of meaning. Quite another, snootily wish away the indispensable central role of the individual creator. One of her greatest strengths, in fact, lay in the fact that part of her always remained, I think, a straightforward, uncomplicated humanist of the left, which explains much about, actually, a total lack of interest in most Marxists, and for that matter, the work of Michel Foucault, with his bleak evacuation of individuals as moral agents from history. This is also something fundamental that she shared with her greatest American hero. Nowadays, I think almost completely forgotten, but when I was a teenager, a figure of international celebrity, the maverick writer come psychotherapist Paul Goodman, 1911 to 1972, concerning whom she wrote very movingly an important obituary essay included in her collection Under the Sign of Saturn. And I think to really understand Susan Sontag, it's helpful to read something about Paul Goodman. Perhaps the first thing one might say of her as a non-fiction writer, as I say, I'm not talking about her fiction today, is that she was involved primarily in a debate with herself, which she conducted at least partly in public. She was a public intellectual in America, one of the last of a 20th century lineage, whose swan song was somewhat grumpily written by Russell Jacoby, the wonderful book, The Last Intellectuals, which I'd strongly recommend to all of you who are interested in that particular political lineage. Born like Philip Roth in 1933, she came to fame in the late 1960s, in her case as the kind of Joan Baez of semiotic chic, the messiah in America of European avant-garde cinema and culture, mainly, as I've suggested, in that Francophile, though also very much German too, surrealist tradition. Quite how she managed to square her admiration for the shy, fastidious, melancholy Walter Benjamin with her regard for such shallow, self-promoting and egotistical figures as André Breton and Louis Aragon remains to be rather obscure. Though I note that in this particular contradiction, she was actually entirely typical rather than an exception to her generation of American avant-garde critics and practitioners, for that matter. Nobody gave a fig, I think, Louis Aragon stayed a card-carrying Communist Party member very much in New York. I doubt if they actually knew. Cultured and urbane, she was from the start primarily an essayist. I have to say immediately, I think this is one very good reason to admire her. One doesn't necessarily have to write books. Very often what we need to say doesn't need 50,000 words, let alone 150,000 words. 5,000 words is a good sandwich. It's nourishing. 10,000 words is better, but beyond that, something else happens. Susan Sontag had a very acute sense of the difference between 2,000, 5,000 and 10,000. And you feel it right the way through everything she ever wrote. Another good reason to be interested in her, I think, is that she wasn't an academic. And lacking inherited wealth of any kind, having refused, in fact, any kind of alimony from her first husband when they separated, a much older academic, Philip Reeve, distinguished Freudian scholar. She worked hard all her life to fund her lifelong engagement, both in America and overseas, with art and politics and ideas. Albeit in the later part of her life, she was funded by her partner Annie Leibovitz, but I don't think Annie Leibovitz came into her life until 1989. She was therefore, in a particular way, beholden unto no one but herself. And this evidently, I think, seems to have protected her from the clanism of the academy. She belonged to no school. This also seems to have meant, on the downside, that she wasn't exactly what you'd call a team player. Certainly modesty wasn't her strong card, but then again, why should it have been? You know, she was very smart. She'd come from nowhere. She'd made it all up. She made the friends. She'd written the book, the first book. I've had 3 friends in my life who knew her well in varying degrees, and all recount similar stories of initial devoted discipleship, followed by eventual peremptory exile from favour. In Desperately Seeking Susan, an essay first published in the London Review of Books, Professor Terry Castle, and included in her wonderful, wonderful book published 2 years ago, The Professor and Other Writings. Terry Castle tells some extremely funny stories of her own particular enslavement to Sontag. undermined, amongst other things, by, at one point, to my mind, the extraordinary naivety of Susan Sontag's description of why she never came out as a lesbian or was a bisexual, quote unquote, because she didn't believe in labels. As if identity politics was simply something about arbitrarily tying on labels. But anyway, that's another lecture I'll give there, just starting at that point. Briefly, just a little bit of Terry Carlson and Susan Sontag. From my point of view, it had all begun extraordinarily well. I have to confess that early on, Sontag gave me a couple of the sweetest, not to mention the most amusing moments of my adult life. The first came one grey magical morning in Stamford in 1996, when after several hours of slogging away on student papers, I opened a strange manila envelope that had come from me with a New York return address. The contents, a brief fan letter about a piece I'd written on Charlotte Bronte, and a flamboyantly inscribed paperback copy of her play, Alice in Bed, from Susan, made me dizzy with ecstasy. Having idolised Sontag for decades, I felt as if Pallas Athene herself had suddenly materialised and offered me a cup of ambrosia. Oh, great Susan, oh, august goddess of female intellectuals, and so on and so forth. So she's admirably self-mocking, of course, in the picture that she paints of their friendship. Susan Sontag goes to Stanford, complains immediately on entering the Humanities Centre about the dreariness of ordinary Stanford colleagues. Terry, don't you loathe academics as much as I do? How can you abide it? And her considered views on everything. Yes, Terry, I do know all the lesser known Handel operas. I told Andrew Porter he was right. They are the greatest of musical masterpieces. I was rapt, like a hysterical spinster on her first visit to Bayreuth, and so on and so forth. It's terrific. The whole book is a terrific read. But the picture of Susan Sontag that emerges is one